She pulled a dying man from the snow and asked nothing in return. What she could not have known, dragging a stranger's unconscious body across 3 inches of fresh snowfall at dawn, was that she was also dragging in a title, a fortune, 4 estates, a grief he had not yet named, and a set of complications that would follow her all the way to London and back again. This is the story of Nell Archer, a woman who had survived everything by needing nothing, and of what happened when she finally, stubbornly, terrifyingly met something she could not manage to need a little less. It has a secret, a rival, a portrait on a wall, and a blue wool scarf that turns up at the end when you have almost forgotten about it. Subscribe so you never miss an episode. Drop a comment. Were you rooting for Nell from the very first snow? The morning Nell Archer found him, the snow had been falling for 3 days without pause. She was not the kind of woman who stopped to think about omens. Omens were for women who had the luxury of superstition, women who sat by fires and waited for life to happen to them. Nell was 22 years old in the January of 1822, the sole occupant of a stone cottage at the base of Ashford Mountain in Derbyshire. And she had learned, early and without gentleness, that nothing good came from standing still. She had gone out at dawn to check the rabbit snares she had set the previous afternoon, her breath a small cloud before her face, her boots leaving dark prints in the otherwise unbroken white. The mountain above was invisible, swallowed by grey sky, and the birch trees along the slope stood skeletal and silent. She carried a lantern in one hand and a knife at her hip, not out of fear, but out of habit. The kind of habit that keeps a person alive. She found him approximately 40 yards from the base of the mountain trail, face down in the snow. Her first reaction was not panic, it was assessment. She crouched beside him and pressed 2 fingers to the side of his throat. There, a pulse, thin and reedy but present. She turned him over, and even half buried in snow, even with his lips beginning to turn the particular shade of blue she had seen before on shepherds who had misjudged the weather, she could tell he was not a local man. His coat was too fine. His boots, though now soaked through, had once been expensive. There was a signet ring on his right hand, dark gold against pale skin, that cost more than Nell's cottage and everything in it. She did not think about any of that for long. She thought about his weight, and whether she could manage it alone. She could. It took her nearly 20 minutes to drag him back to the cottage, a task that left her arms burning and her temper short. She stripped his outer layers with brisk efficiency. She had grown up poor and practical, and modesty was a luxury belonging to people who had never needed to be useful. Wrapped him in every blanket she owned, and built the fire up to a roar. She forced willow bark tea between his lips. She sat beside him on the floor through the rest of the morning and most of the afternoon, watching the blue leave his lips and the shaking begin. The shaking was good. The shaking meant his body was fighting. It was cold in the cottage still, despite the fire. Cold enough that she pulled the old woman's dark blue wool scarf from the peg by the door and wrapped it around her own shoulders while she waited. It was the only truly warm thing in the room. She had been meaning to unravel it for the yarn. When he finally opened his eyes, it was past 4 in the afternoon, and the light through the cottage's single window had gone the deep amber of late winter dusk. Nell was sitting at the table eating bread and cold salt pork when she heard the change in his breathing, and she looked over to find him staring at the ceiling with the bewildered expression of a man who had expected to wake up dead. She crossed the room, set a cup of water beside him, and said, without preamble, "You fell. I brought you here. You have been unconscious most of the day and you are not dead, though it was closer than you would probably like to know." He turned his head and looked at her. Whatever he saw, a young woman with dark hair escaping a braid, flower on one sleeve, a gaze that measured him without flinching. It seemed to settle something behind his expression, not comfort exactly, more like recognition, as though he had expected the world to be difficult, and here it was, being difficult in a way that was at least honest. "My horse," he said. His voice was rough, scraped raw by cold. "I did not find a horse," Nell told him. "The trail up the mountain is impassable in this snow. If you came down from there, the horse likely turned back to whatever stable it knows." A long silence settled between them. Outside, wind moved through the birches with a sound like breathing. Then, "How far are we from Ashford Hall?" Nell's hands stilled for just a moment. Ashford Hall was the great house on the other side of the mountain, seat of the Ashford estate, empty for years and recently, so the village gossip went, inherited by some distant relation of the old Viscount. She had heard the servants had been reinstated. She had not thought much about it. She tried, as a rule, not to think about Ashford Hall at all. 3 miles, she said. 4 in this weather. You will not make it tonight." "No," he agreed, and closed his eyes. "I don't suppose I will." He did not tell her his name that day, and she did not ask. That too was a kind of pride, hers, not his, the pride of a woman who had learned that names were the beginning of complications. He stayed 3 days. The snow made the decision for both of them, piling itself against the cottage door with a kind of cheerful indifference to anyone's plans. By the second morning, when Nell stepped outside to collect wood, she sank to the knee at the first step. She came back in brushing snow from her shoulders and announced that her guest would not be leaving today either, and would he like porridge, or was he the sort of man who turned his nose up at it? He was not. He ate 2 bowls and thanked her with a gravity that struck her as almost touching, as though he had forgotten that gratitude was a simple thing, something that could be delivered over a bowl of porridge without ceremony. His name, she learned on the second day, was Harrison. He offered it without surname, and she accepted it without comment, offering her own in return. Just Nell, just Harrison. In the small world of the cottage, that seemed enough. He was 30 years old. He told her this when she asked, because she needed to know how long he might have been in the cold before she found him. And the question was medical, not personal. 30 years old, and he carried those years in a particular way, not in lines on his face, which was still sharply handsome in the way of men who have always had enough to eat, but in a quality of stillness that went beyond composure. He was a man who had decided, at some point, not to want things. The decision had not made him cruel. It had made him careful. Nell was not careful. She was direct, and she was busy, and she did not have the patience for a man who answered questions in half sentences. So by the second afternoon, she simply talked at him while she worked, telling him about the snares, about the way the mountain changed in different seasons, about the old woman who had left her the cottage and died the previous spring, about the village 3 miles down the road where she sold herbs and sometimes game. She did not tell him why she lived alone or where she had come from before the cottage. Those were her half sentences, and she kept them. He listened. That was the thing she noticed first and forgot to stop noticing. He listened with his full attention, without preparing his next remark while she was still speaking. It was unsettling to be listened to like that. It felt uncomfortably close to being seen. On the evening of the second day, he asked her to teach him to sharpen a knife. She looked at him sideways, because it was a strange request from a man with hands that clearly spent their time doing other things. But she sat beside him at the table and talked him through it, correcting his angle twice with a directness that would have been rude if either of them had been inclined to stand on ceremony. They weren't. "You are not afraid of anything, are you?" he said, and it was not quite a question. "Plenty of things," she said. "I am just not afraid of you." Something crossed his face, not offense, not surprise exactly. Something more like the expression of a man who has been handed a thing he did not know he needed. He looked back down at the knife. "No," he said quietly. "I don't suppose you are." The third day the snow began to ease. By afternoon, a pale, exhausted sun appeared for the first time in a week, and the world outside the cottage window shimmered with the particular brightness of fresh snow under new light. Nell stood at the window for a moment longer than she needed to, watching it. When she turned, Harrison was watching her instead of the window, and he looked away so quickly that she might have imagined it. She didn't imagine it. He left the following morning. Nell handed him the dark blue wool scarf from the peg by the door, the one she had been meaning to unravel for the yarn, the one she had worn herself the night he arrived. She told herself it was practical. He would need it for the road. He accepted it without argument, wrapping it around his neck with the matter-of-fact air of a man who had learned, over 3 days, not to refuse her practical decisions. At the door he paused, and she saw him choose between several things he might have said, and then discard all of them. "Thank you, Nell," he said at last. Simple, the same way he had said thank you for the porridge. "Safe journey, Harrison," she said, and watched him walk up the snow-muffled road toward Ashford Hall, with the blue scarf around his neck, already half swallowed by the morning mist. She thought that would be the end of it. The village of Lower Ashford had approximately 300 souls and approximately 3,000 opinions. And it took Nell exactly one trip to market, the first Friday after the snow cleared, in mid-January of 1822, to understand that the new master of Ashford Hall had arrived, had been lost in the snowstorm, and had been found by a young woman who lived alone on the mountain road. She stood at the flower merchant's counter and listened to Mrs. Peabody tell the story back to her as though Nell were not the young woman in question, and she kept her face very still while she learned that the new master of Ashford Hall was not a distant cousin of the old Viscount after all. He was Harrison Windermere, the Duke of Windermere. A duke. She had fed a duke porridge and corrected his knife-sharpening technique and told him, without blinking, that he was not as frightening as he probably thought he was. She had also given him a dead woman's scarf and watched him walk away in it. She paid for her flour, picked up her basket, and walked home in the cold morning air, and she did not think about it, or rather, she thought about it constantly, but only in the way one prods a bruise, not to heal it, but to understand its edges. A duke. Well, that explained the boots. She had almost managed to file the whole thing neatly away. 3 days. A stranger, the beginning of nothing, when the knock came on her door that same afternoon. She opened it to find a footman in Ashford Hall livery, holding a folded note, who bowed with a formality so complete that Nell felt briefly as though she had opened the door onto a stage. The note was short. It said, "I find I owe you a debt I have not yet adequately acknowledged. If you are willing, I would speak with you. W." Just W. Still no ceremony. She wrote back 2 lines on the back of his note because she had no other paper at hand. "You owe me nothing, but if you are determined to be indebted, I drink tea. N." He came the next afternoon, on horseback, without the footman. He tied his horse to the post by her gate, her very modest, entirely unducal gate, and knocked on her door, and she let him in and made tea, and they sat on either side of her small table like 2 people who had done this before, which of course they had, though the circumstances had been different. "You know who I am now," he said. "I do. Does it change things?" She considered this seriously, which he seemed to appreciate. "It explains some things," she said finally. "It does not change what happened. You were cold and you needed help. I helped you. That is a very simple story, whatever your title is." He was quiet for a moment, turning his teacup in his hands. She had the sense that he was rearranging something inside himself, carefully, the way one rearranges a room that has been lived in too long and grown cluttered. "I would like to call on you again," he said, "if that would not be unwelcome." She should have said no. Any sensible woman in her position, a woman with a secret, a woman with a past she had buried carefully under the mountain road, would have said no. "It would not be unwelcome," she said. He came back 6 more times over the course of January and February. Each visit was proper, by the loosest definition. He came in the afternoon. He stayed no more than 2 hours. Her door was never closed. But propriety is a frame, not a painting, and what passed between them during those 6 afternoons had very little to do with decorum and a great deal to do with 2 people who had separately and for different reasons, learned to keep the world at a comfortable distance, and were finding for her with some alarm, that distance difficult to maintain. She learned things about him in pieces, that he had inherited the dukedom at 24, upon the sudden death of his father in 1816. That he had spent the 6 years since doing his duty so thoroughly and relentlessly that it had become a kind of armour, the meetings, the tenants, the parliamentary obligations, the charitable foundations, the management of 4 estates across England, that 3 years prior, in the autumn of 1819, a woman named Eleanor Voss, his intended, chosen by mutual agreement and genuine affection, had died of a fever before they could marry, that he had not been back to Ashford Hall since his childhood, and had come now, partly because the estate needed attention, and partly because London had become a place where every room held something he was trying not to feel. He told her these things not all at once, but in the way that private people tell private things, sideways, while talking about something else, in sentences that trailed off and were not retrieved. She did not push. She filed each piece away with the same careful attention she gave to everything, and offered her own truths in similar fragments. She told him she had come to the cottage 4 years ago, in the spring of 1818, when she was 18. After the death of her mother, she told him she had grown up in the village of Marston, 12 miles east, where her mother had been a seamstress. She told him she preferred winter to summer because the silence was cleaner. She did not tell him who her father was. She did not tell him that she had known since she was 15, had been told by her mother in the terrible quiet of a sick room in 1815, that the man who had made and then abandoned them both was Edmund Archer, the 4th Viscount of Ashford, the very man whose house Harrison now occupied, whose portrait, she had no doubt, still hung in the long gallery. She did not tell him that her surname, Archer, was not her mother's name and not her father's name, but a name her mother had chosen deliberately, bitterly, like a message no one was meant to decode. I drew back my bow. I had my aim, and I missed anyway. These were the things she kept. Every other thing she gave freely. In the middle of February, during his 6th visit, the fire burned low, and neither of them moved to build it up. And at some point, the conversation stopped, and the silence that replaced it was not empty. It was the kind of silence that has weight, that means something, that presses against the chest. They were sitting very close together, closer than they usually sat. The cottage being small and both of them having, over the weeks, gradually stopped maintaining the careful physical distance of acquaintances. He lifted his hand and brushed a strand of dark hair from her face, and his fingers barely grazed her cheekbone, and the touch was so light it almost was not a touch at all. But her breath changed, and his did too. "Nell," he said. "Don't," she said, not unkindly, but with a steadiness that cost her something. He dropped his hand. He did not ask why. He seemed to understand that why was a room she was not ready to open, and he respected that the way he had respected everything about her. Seriously, without making it smaller than it was. He left that afternoon, as he always did, and she stood at the window and watched him ride away, and told herself this was wisdom. The Duke of Windermere did not belong in her world, and she, no matter what her blood said, did not belong in his. The secret she carried would make it worse, not better. If he knew who her father was, he would look at her differently. He would see the illegitimacy, the abandonment, the shabby inheritance of a man who had never claimed her. She was Nell Archer, who lived alone and kept snares and made her own way. She believed all of this. It did not help as much as it should have. He came on a Thursday in early March, and something about him was different from the first moment, something resolved in his bearing, something decided, that made Nell set down the mending she had been doing and look at him properly before he had even sat down. "I am required in London by the end of the month," he said. "The season begins in April, and I have obligations I cannot avoid. But I find—" He stopped, started again, quieter. The voice he used when he was saying the true thing rather than the diplomatic one. I find that I do not want to leave things as they are." "How are they?" she asked, though she thought she knew. "Unfinished," he said. "Or rather, finished in a way that is all wrong, and I don't want them to be." He told her, then, that he wanted her to come to London. Not as a servant, not as a kept woman. He was very careful about that, and she appreciated the care. He wanted her to come as companion to his widowed aunt, Lady Margot Finch, which would give her a position that was legitimate if not exalted, and which would allow them to see each other in London society, and to discover. He said this looking at his hands, which she found unreasonably endearing. Whether what had begun in the cottage could become something more. "You are asking me to enter society," she said. "I am asking you to give us a chance," he said. And there it was, the unguarded thing underneath all that composure, simple and enormous, and entirely without armour. She should have told him then, about her father, about Edmund Archer, whose name was carved above the fireplace at Ashford Hall, whose portrait hung in the gallery, who was the reason she had never once gone near that house in the 4 years she had lived at its foot. She should have told him she was the Viscount's unacknowledged daughter, born on the wrong side of every line that mattered in his world, and that London society would eat her alive the moment someone connected the name Archer to the Ashford estate. She should have told him. She said, "Give me a week to think about it." She thought about it for 3 days and then sent him a note that said, "Yes." 1 word. She told herself she would explain everything before they left for London. She told herself there would be a right moment. She had been lying to herself about a great many things that spring, and she was not yet ready to stop. The day before they were to leave for London, Harrison sent a note asking if she would come to the Hall. He wanted to show her the estate before they left it for the season, he said. It seemed the right thing to do. Nell stood at her cottage door with his note in her hand for a long moment. Then she put on her good coat and walked the 3 miles to Ashford Hall. It was a clear March morning. The last of the snow melted, and the ground soft underfoot. The hall came into view as she crested the hill, pale stone, long windows, older than it looked and vaster than she had imagined. She had lived 3 miles from it for 4 years and never once approached it. She had kept that distance deliberately, the way you keep a distance from a thing that has the power to confirm your worst fears about yourself. Harrison met her at the door himself, which surprised her, and walked her through the rooms with the quiet pride of a man who has inherited something he is only beginning to understand. She listened and nodded and looked at the ceilings and the windows and the portraits on the walls, and she kept her breathing steady and her face composed. And she was doing very well until the long gallery. He was halfway through saying something about the East Wing restoration when Nell stopped walking. The portrait was large, in the manner of portraits commissioned by men who want to be remembered as larger than they were. He was perhaps 50 in the painting, red-faced and self-satisfied, with the particular expression of a man who has never once been told no. Edmund Archer, 4th Viscount of Ashford, read the small gold plate at the base of the frame. 1762, 1809, dead 13 years. She had never seen his face before. Her mother had refused to describe him. She looked at the painting for a long time. Harrison had fallen quiet beside her, sensing something, and she was grateful for his silence, for the fact that he did not fill the moment with words, but simply stood beside her and let her have it. He had her nose, or rather, she had his nose, and his stubborn set of the jaw, and she had spent 22 years with those features on her own face, without ever knowing where they had come from. There was something both terrible and clarifying about seeing the source of a thing at last. It did not make her feel more connected to him. It made her feel less afraid of him, which was different, and in some ways better. "I knew him," Harrison said at last, carefully. "Very slightly. He died when I was 17. I remember thinking he was a man who took up more room than he deserved." She turned to look at him. He was watching her with that full, unguarded attention, and she understood, in the way that understanding sometimes arrives without warning, that he already knew, or suspected, or had been waiting for her to be ready. "He was my father," she said. Her voice was steady. She had decided, somewhere in the walk between the portrait and that sentence, to be steady. "I have never told you. I should have. He and my mother, it was not a kindness, what he did. He left her with nothing except me and his name, which she took and altered and threw back at the world. Archer. That is why I have never come near this house." Harrison was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I see. Are you—" "No," he said firmly, before she could finish. I am not reconsidering anything. I am standing here thinking that you walked 3 miles to face this, on the day before we leave for London together, and that you are one of the most extraordinary people I have ever met." He paused. "And I am thinking that Edmund Archer was even more of a fool than I had gathered, which is saying something." The tension in her chest released so suddenly that she felt almost lightheaded. She turned back to the portrait, and this time she looked at it, not with dread, but with the clear-eyed assessment she gave to everything. A man, dead and gone, whose choices she had been carrying without consent. "I do not need anything from him," she said. "I just needed to see him." "Yes," Harrison said simply. "I thought you might." They stood side by side in the long gallery for another minute, and then she turned away from the portrait, deliberately, finally, and they walked back through the hall together toward the door and the bright March morning beyond it. London in the season of 1822 was a city that ran on scrutiny. Every ball, every dinner, every afternoon call was an act of assessment. Who had money, who had breeding, who had made a good match, and who was about to make a catastrophic one. The newspapers ran society columns that were read over breakfast by people who would have denied caring about them. The drawing rooms of Mayfair functioned as a vast collective intelligence, cataloguing, comparing, and commenting on everything that moved through them. Nell arrived into this world in the second week of April, in Harrison's aunt's comfortable townhouse on Wimpole Street, dressed in clothes that had been quietly and expensively provided by Harrison's arrangement. She had argued with him about it via letter for a week, before conceding that she could not walk into a London ballroom in her Derbyshire wool without undoing everything before it had begun. Lady Margot Finch, Harrison's widowed aunt, was 63 years old, small, sharp-eyed, and so thoroughly amused by the situation that she greeted Nell with a frankness that Nell found immediately comforting. "My nephew has never done anything impulsive in his adult life," Lady Margot said, on Nell's first evening, over supper. "Whatever you did to him up on that mountain, it appears to have worked. I am delighted. The boy has been miserable for years. He was hypothermic," Nell said. "I gave him porridge. Magic porridge, apparently," said Lady Margot, and that was the foundation of a friendship. The first ball of the season was held at Devonshire House on the 14th of April, and Nell attended on Lady Margot's arm, in deep green silk that she was told complemented her complexion, and which she found she could breathe in, which was her primary requirement. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for difficult terrain, by studying it, understanding it, and deciding what she needed to do to get through it. She danced when she was asked. She spoke carefully and observed more. She was introduced to a great many people whose names she committed to memory with the same efficiency she applied to everything. Harrison found her at 11 o'clock, after her third dance, in a momentary quiet near the windows overlooking the garden. He looked at her the way he had looked at her across the cottage table, as though she was worth looking at, not because of the green silk, but because of what was underneath it. And she felt the warmth of it move through her like something she could not quite name. "How are you finding it?" he asked. "Loud," she said, "and very expensive smelling. How do you stand it?" "Badly," he said, and smiled, and she thought that for a man who smiled rarely, he did it extraordinarily well. They talked for 20 minutes, which was exactly 20 minutes longer than was strictly proper, and she could feel the weight of observation from the room behind her, the small adjustments of gaze, the tilted heads, the way conversation at the edges of a ballroom accommodates new information. She was being catalogued. She understood that. What she did not yet understand was that she was being catalogued by someone in particular, someone who had been watching Harrison Windermere for much longer than Nell had, and who had decided that very evening that this new development required attention. Lady Cecily Vane was 32 years old, twice widowed, and possessed of the kind of beauty that had been carefully maintained as a professional exercise. She wore white and diamonds, laughed at exactly the right moments, and had been working toward Harrison Windermere for 2 years with the patience of a woman who understood that the best sieges were conducted without the other party realizing they were under siege. Nell did not notice her that first evening. She would notice her very soon. Their first meeting was at a morning call in the 3rd week of April, at the home of a baroness whose name Nell had forgotten by the time she stepped back into the carriage. Lady Cecily was already there. She rose when Nell and Lady Margot were announced, and she greeted them with a warmth so practiced it could have passed for genuine if Nell had not spent months watching a man who had perfected not wanting things, and learned what authenticity looked like by contrast. "I'm Miss Archer," she said, taking Nell's hand. "I have heard so much about you. The woman who rescued our dear Duke from the snow. Quite the dramatic beginning." "Quite ordinary, really," Nell said. "He was cold. I had blankets." Lady Cecily's smile did not change, but something behind it rearranged. How refreshingly modest. "You must tell me everything about Derbyshire. I confess I have never seen the appeal, but perhaps I have simply not had the right guide." The conversation that followed was extremely pleasant and entirely hostile, conducted below the surface of what was actually being said. Lady Cecily asked about Nell's family, so charmingly, so casually, the question almost invisible inside the warmth of apparent interest. Nell answered as she always had. Her mother had been a seamstress in Marston. Her father had not been present in her life. She had lived alone in Derbyshire for 4 years. "How extraordinary," Lady Cecily said. "And entirely alone. No family nearby at all." "None that claimed me," Nell said pleasantly, and watched Lady Cecily process this and file it away with the efficiency of a woman who collected information the way others collected debts. On the carriage home, Lady Margot was quiet for a long moment and then said, "You will need to be careful with that one." "I know," said Nell. "She has been set on Harrison for 2 years. She is also intelligent, well-connected, and she will use whatever she finds." Nell looked out the carriage window at the grey London afternoon. "There is nothing to find," she said, and this time, unlike the last time she'd believed it, it was almost true. She had told Harrison about her father herself. She had faced the portrait. She had taken the story out of the dark where it had lived for 7 years and put it somewhere with air and light. What Lady Cecily might discover would not be a secret any longer. It would just be the truth. She told herself this firmly. It helped. Mostly. What happened between Nell and Harrison in London was different from what had happened in Derbyshire, and the same, and more. In Derbyshire, there had been the contained world of the cottage. 2 people, a fire, the honesty that comes from having no audience. London offered something else, the strange intimacy of being 2 people who moved differently through the same world, who could look across a ballroom and understand each other without speaking. He came to Wimpole Street on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, officially to call on his aunt. Actually, as Lady Margot put it, with her cheerful bluntness, because he could not help himself. He and Nell walked in the park, attended concerts, sat in drawing rooms, making the careful formal conversation of people who were also conducting an entirely different conversation underneath it. He was giving her, without announcing it, the context she needed to move through his world, not by correcting her, but by explaining its architecture, by treating her intelligence with the respect it deserved. She was teaching him things too. She had said once that she was not afraid of him, and it had mattered. She understood that more clearly now, in London, where she could see the shape of his life, the deference from every quarter, the way people managed themselves around his title, the constant small adjustments that power requires from everyone near it. She did not adjust. She never had. And watching him absorb that, watching him breathe differently when he was with her, the particular loosening of something held too long, made her feel things she had deliberately decided not to feel. One evening in May, walking back from the park in the long golden light of a spring evening, he stopped on the pavement and turned to face her and said, without preamble, "I am falling in love with you. I thought you should know." She looked at him for a long moment. The light was in his face, and she could see everything in it. The fear, the resolve, the way he had decided to say the true thing instead of the safe one, the particular vulnerability of a man who has spent 6 years behind glass and has just stepped through it. "Harrison, you do not have to say anything," he said quickly. "I'm not asking for anything. I find I do not want to keep pretending it is not true." She reached up and touched his face. Just that, her hand against his jaw, the warmth of it. He closed his eyes for a moment, and she felt him lean into the touch with such a simple, unguarded need that her chest ached with something between tenderness and grief. Grief for all the time he had spent not allowing himself to need anything at all. "There is something you should know," she said. "About me, about my father." "I know," he said quietly. She blinked. "Up to you?" "I have known since the gallery," he said. "Or rather, I had suspected since the first time I read the name Archer on your note. And I understood it completely when I saw you standing in front of that portrait. I did not say anything because it was yours to say, not mine." He turned his head slightly, so that his cheek pressed into her palm. "You were going to tell me." "I was," she said, "on the road to London, and then in London, and then you told me in the gallery, without words," he said. That was enough. She looked at him for a long moment, at the patience in him, the steadiness, the man who had spent 3 years being devoured by guilt over a death he had not caused and had learned, in that time, what it was to carry something that could not be put down. He understood, she realized. He understood what it was to be held in place by a story that was not entirely yours. "Eleanor," she said, "you have never talked about her, not properly." Something shifted in his face, not the closing off she had braced for, but the opposite, a kind of careful opening, the look of a man who has been waiting for permission. "She was kind," he said, "genuinely kind, which is rarer than it should be. We suited each other well enough. I have thought for a long time that I did not love her as I should have, that if I had, somehow, she would not have, which is not logical. I understand that perfectly well. And yet," he stopped. "I have spent 3 years being very productive and very useful and not thinking about it. And now I am standing on a pavement in London with your hand on my face," he said. And the simplicity of it, the plain exhausted honesty of it, struck her somewhere under the sternum. "And I think I have been afraid since Eleanor of wanting something this much, because wanting things is how you lose them." "Yes," Nell said. She knew that particular arithmetic intimately. "It is also how you have them." He turned his face and pressed his lips to her palm. A light, brief pressure, not quite a kiss, and she felt it everywhere. "Give me a little more time," he said. "I am getting there." "You have time," she said. "Take it." Lady Cecily did not find a secret. What she found instead was a story, and a story, in the right hands, can be more damaging than a secret, because it requires no proof and admits no defense. By the 3rd week of May, The thing had begun to circulate in the particular way that London stories circulate, not as accusation, but as question. Had anyone looked into Miss Archer's family? It was so interesting. Her surname and the Ashford estate. Had nobody noticed the coincidence? What did anyone actually know about this woman Harrison Windermere had brought from the country? It was beautifully done. No single remark that could be traced. Just a series of small fires, each one plausibly accidental, collectively producing a great deal of smoke. Nell became aware of it gradually, through the small but legible changes in how rooms received her, the fractional pause before a greeting, the conversation that shifted when she approached, the particular quality of smile that means I am being polite because I have not yet decided. She noted each one carefully and said nothing, because she had learned, growing up, that silence was information too. She did not tell Harrison immediately. She needed a few days first, to sit with the feeling, which was not quite humiliation and not quite anger, but something in between, something that had teeth. She had walked into this world knowing the risk. She had done so anyway. She did not regret it, but she had not expected the risk to arrive quite so efficiently, and she would not pretend, even to herself, that it did not sting. She gave herself 2 evenings alone to feel it properly. She sat in her room at Wimpole Street and let the feeling have its full shape. The particular weariness of being made to justify your existence in rooms that had not invited you, the anger at a woman who saw her as an obstacle rather than a person, the older, deeper ache of knowing that her father's choices were still, 12 years after his death, 13 years after his abandonment, capable of reaching into her life and making it smaller. Then she folded it away, not gone. She was not the sort of person who pretended feelings disappeared when they were inconvenient, but filed, managed. She had been managing things since she was 15 years old. She was very good at it. On the 3rd evening she told Harrison, and he wanted, immediately, to respond publicly. She told him not to. A direct defence was a confirmation. The story required a response that was not a defence at all. Lady Margot had connections in London that had nothing to do with ballrooms and everything to do with decades of strategic intelligence gathering. She had known Lady Cecily's late second husband quite well. It transpired. And she knew certain things about the settlements, the legal arrangements accompanying Lady Cecily's second marriage and its convenient termination by the husband's death, that Lady Cecily would very much prefer remained unexamined. It was Lady Margot who approached her, over tea at a small establishment on Bond Street, and laid out, with the same cheer she applied to everything, exactly what she knew, and exactly what she was prepared to ensure remained private, in exchange for a very simple agreement. Lady Cecily would find that her interest in Harrison Windermere had, on reflection, cooled. She would redirect her considerable energies elsewhere. She would allow the small fires she had lit to go out on their own. Lady Cecily was too intelligent to miscalculate her options. She agreed, and left London for the country at the end of May, citing the need for fresh air. Society replaced her in its attention within the week. "I did not need you to fight my battle," Nell said to Lady Margot that evening. "No," Lady Margot agreed serenely. But I have been fighting my nephew's battles since he was 7 years old and he never objects. So I thought you might tolerate it too. And besides," she patted Nell's hand, "that woman was getting on my nerves." Nell laughed, a short, real laugh, and felt the last of the filed-away feeling finally release. It did not leave her empty. It left her lighter. With Lady Cecily gone and the fires left to go out, what society decided about Nell Archer was ultimately determined by Harrison himself. He did not hide her. He did not present her with apology or excessive explanation. He brought her to functions, introduced her clearly, and treated her with a directness and warmth that told anyone paying attention exactly what she was to him. Communicated through a glance across a ballroom and a deliberate lack of deference to anyone else's opinion. Society, which ultimately follows the lead of whoever is most certain, decided to accept her, not uniformly, not without continued murmur in corners, but enough that by June she could walk into a drawing room on Harrison's arm and have the majority of greetings be genuine, and the others at least polite. There were dinners at which she felt the seams of who she was straining against the room she was in, and she would look up and find Harrison watching, and the look on his face was never pity. It was a kind of fierce, quiet solidarity that settled her better than any reassurance could have. He knew what it cost her. She knew what it cost him to be truly known, to have someone know the grief and the guilt and the years of relentless duty, to have that known and loved rather than managed around. They were two people who had learned to live at a careful distance from the world, and they were learning, together and with the occasional spectacular difficulty, to close it. In the last week of June, the season winding down and London beginning its annual loosening, Harrison took her to Kensington Gardens in the early morning, before the paths were busy, and asked her to marry him. He did not make a performance of it. He stopped on the path beside the round pond, where the light was coming through the trees in long horizontal lines the way it does in early summer mornings, and he turned to face her and said, with the same directness she had always given him, returned to her exactly, that he wanted to spend his life with her, that he understood the complications, that he was not asking because she had saved his life in the snow, though she had, or because she was the most remarkable person he had known, though she was, but because when he imagined his future without her in it, he felt the absence of her like a physical thing, like something taken from a room that you cannot identify until you find you cannot breathe. He said that he knew he was asking a great deal. That marriage to him came with the full weight of his world, the obligations, the scrutiny, the life she had walked away from once before when she had chosen a stone cottage over everything that belonging might have required of her. "I know what I am asking," he said. "I want you to know that I know." She looked at him for a long time. The light moved in the trees. Somewhere behind them, a pair of ducks made their entirely unromantic noise on the water. "I have spent a long time," she said slowly, "making myself into someone who does not need anything. It felt like strength. I think—" She stopped, tried again. "I think some of it was, and some of it was just being so afraid of needing something and not having it that I made not needing into a virtue." She looked at his face, at the hope in it he was not entirely managing to conceal, at the patience, at the man who had spent 3 years in grief and 6 years in duty, and had somehow come out the other side with the capacity to love someone this openly. You are the first person who has ever made me want to stop being afraid." He reached up and tucked a piece of her dark hair behind her ear, a gesture so familiar now that she had stopped noticing it, except that she always noticed it. "Is that a yes?" he asked. "It is very much a yes," she said. He kissed her there by the round pond in the early morning light, with the ducks in the background and the trees shifting overhead, and it was not the contained, careful touch of the Derbyshire evenings. It was longer and warmer, and full of the kind of certainty that only arrives when something has been decided at the level that precedes all other decisions. "There is no going back from this," they were both saying, and neither of them wanted to. The engagement announcement appeared in the papers on the 3rd of July, 1822. By the standards of the announcements around it, it was unremarkable. Harrison Windermere, Duke of Windermere, had become engaged to Miss Nell Archer of Derbyshire. 3 lines, no fanfare. The reaction was predictably mixed. There were those who found it charming. A rescue in the snow, a self-made young woman. A duke who had been closed off for years and was clearly no longer so, and treated it as the kind of story the season always needed, the one that cut through the tedium of matched fortune to matched fortune. There were those who found it irregular and made discreet inquiries into Nell's family, which produced a more complicated story than Lady Cecily had hoped to leak. Yes, there was a connection to the old Ashford title, but the Duke's handling of it suggested he was aware and entirely unbothered, and when the Duke of Windermere is unbothered, society tends to find itself similarly disinclined to care. Lady Margot gave a dinner for 20 of the most important people she knew, seated Nell at her right hand, and conducted the whole affair with such pointed good cheer that the remaining resistance dissolved into something closer to curiosity. Nell wore gold silk, and was introduced as the Duke's intended. The phrasing deliberate, unqualified. Lady Margot's gift to her, the clearest possible statement of where she stood. Harrison watched Nell work the room that evening, not performing, not managing, but genuinely engaging, asking questions that revealed she had been paying close attention to people for months, remembering things, making connections, and the look on his face across the candlelit table was one that Lady Margot caught and found so nakedly glad that she looked away to give him his privacy. Later, after the guests had gone and Lady Margot had retreated with the serene efficiency of a woman who knows when to leave a room, Nell and Harrison sat in the drawing room in the comfortable quiet that had been their version of intimacy since the beginning, two people inhabiting the same silence, not needing to fill it. "You were frightened tonight," he said. "Observation, not question." "At the beginning," she admitted. "Less so by the end." "You didn't show it." "I never do." She glanced at him sideways. "Do you think that is a virtue or a flaw?" He considered this with the seriousness he gave to everything. "A virtue in a crisis," he said. "A flaw in a drawing room, if it means people cannot reach you. And a gift," he added quietly, "with someone who knows where to look." She reached across and took his hand, and they sat like that until the candles had burned down to stubs, and neither of them moved to relight them. They were married in September of 1822 in the church of Lower Ashford. It had been Nell's only real stipulation. She had agreed to everything else, the Windermere estate as their primary residence, the full formal weight of becoming a duchess. But this she held. The village at the foot of the mountain, the small church where she had occasionally sat in the back pew on Christmas mornings when her mother was still alive. The community that had known her as a woman who lived alone and managed and did not need anything. She wanted to be married there because she wanted those people to see her. She had learned, slowly, over one long and difficult season, that being witnessed was not weakness, that letting people see you truly was the bravest thing a person could do. The church held 80 people. Every seat was filled. Mrs. Peabody from the flower merchants was in the third row and cried so completely that she made several entirely unrelated women cry in sympathy. Lady Margot sat in the front pew in an extraordinary hat and was visibly, unfashionably delighted. Harrison had not been nervous about the London announcement, or the engagement dinner, or any of the formal proceedings that had surrounded the preceding months. He was, Nell noticed, genuinely nervous in the vestibule of the Lower Ashford church on the morning of their wedding. Standing very still in the way she had learned meant he was managing something, not feeling nothing. She told him so, which made him laugh, a short, startled laugh, and by the time they walked through the doors, it had left him entirely. She remembered the ceremony afterward, not as words, but as moments, the weight of his hand when he took hers. The morning light through old stained glass, scattering colour across stone, the specific expression on his face when she spoke her vows, not the composure she had grown accustomed to, not the closed-off stillness of the man she had first seen lying in the snow, but something completely unguarded, completely present. The face of a man who had not allowed himself to be happy for a very long time, and had finally, irrevocably, decided to stop refusing it. She loved him for all of it. She had known this for longer than she had admitted. After the ceremony, standing outside in the September sunshine while half the village milled around them, with an enthusiasm that entirely ignored the normal protocols of a ducal wedding, he leaned down and said quietly against her hair, "Still not afraid of anything?" She thought about it for a moment, seriously, the way she thought about everything. "Plenty of things," she said, "just not the right ones anymore." The cottage at the foot of Ashford Mountain was repaired in the spring of 1823 by the Windermere Estate's groundskeeping staff at the specific instruction of the new Duchess, who had asked that it be made livable and maintained but not changed. She went there sometimes, not often. Life as the Duchess of Windermere was, as advertised, enormously full, and she had discovered that the obligations she had feared being consumed by had, in fact, become things she was genuinely interested in. The charitable foundations, the estate tenants, who had been somewhat startled by a duchess who arrived at their doors without announcement and asked direct questions about drainage and roof repairs. The small fund she had established with Lady Margot for women in the village of Lower Ashford. Women who needed what Nell had once needed. A foothold, a small piece of ground to stand on while they figured out the rest. She went to the cottage when she needed to think, or when she needed to remember who she was before she was anything else. Harrison had come with her twice, and each time he had sat at the small table where they had first talked and drunk tea and looked around the room with an expression she had come to recognize as the face he made when he was particularly, privately, content. On an afternoon in October of 1825, she went to the cottage alone. Their daughter, Margaret Catherine Windermere, 9 months old, named for Lady Margot and for Nell's mother, in that order, which Lady Margot had found enormously satisfying, was at the hall with her father and a nurse, and Nell had ridden out in the clean autumn air with the particular feeling of a woman who needs an hour of her own. The cottage was cold when she unlocked the door, cold and quiet and smelling of the pine resin the groundskeepers used on the window frames. She lit the fire herself, because she still could, because she still preferred to, and sat down at the small table to wait for the room to warm. It was then that she noticed it, on the peg by the door, the peg where the old woman's scarf had always hung, the peg that had been bare since the January morning she had wrapped the scarf around a stranger's neck and watched him walk away in it. There was the dark blue wool scarf, folded neatly, left there without comment. She stood up and crossed the room and touched it. The wool was soft with age and wore the faint smell of wood smoke that never quite left anything that had spent time in this cottage. Harrison had brought it back. She did not know when, sometime between the wedding and now, sometime in the 3 years of their life together. He had come here alone or arranged for it to be returned and left it without telling her, without making a thing of it. She understood, standing there with the scarf in her hands, that this was exactly what he was like, the man underneath the title, underneath the composure and the careful stillness and the 6 years of armor. He paid attention. He remembered. He gave things back without ceremony. She heard hooves on the road and looked out the window and saw him coming, because of course he had followed her, not because he worried, or not only because he worried, but because he had developed the habit of her and she of him, the kind of habit that does not feel like dependence but like home. She went to the door and opened it before he reached the gate, and the October light was the color of copper and old honey, and he swung down from the horse and looked at her across the short distance of the garden path. Then he saw what she was holding. Something passed across his face, not quite a smile, more the expression of a man who's been caught being tender and does not particularly mind. "You found it," he said. "When?" she asked. "Last autumn. I had been meaning to return it since the wedding." He came through the gate. "You lent it to a stranger. I thought it ought to come back to you." She looked at him, at this man she had dragged out of the snow 3 years ago, who had turned out to be a duke and a grief and a patience and a love, who wore his happiness now like something he had finally stopped apologizing for. And she felt the full weight of the life they had built settle around her, not like a burden, but like an embrace. The cottage, the hall, the daughter asleep 3 miles away, Lady Margot in her extraordinary hats, the portrait in the gallery that had no power over her now, that was simply paint and vanity and a long dead man's legacy that she had declined to inherit. This is mine, she thought, all of it. Not because it was given to her, not because her blood or his title said so, but because she had chosen it clearly and at considerable cost. And it had turned out to be worth every bit of what it had cost. She held out the scarf. "Keep it," she said. "You clearly need it more than I do. You nearly died in the snow." "Once," he said, taking the scarf and wrapping it around his neck with the same matter-of-fact air he had worn 3 years ago. And I had adequate help. Adequate, she repeated. Extraordinary, he said, the single word quiet and entirely without irony. She let him in and went to build up the fire, and he closed the door on the October cold behind them, and the cottage was warm and small and theirs, and outside the mountain stood against the sky, and it was, all of it, exactly enough. Did Nell and Harrison earn their ending? Leave a comment. Which moment stayed with you the longest? Subscribe and never miss the next story. More is coming.